The letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with the royal cipher, and by Thursday morning Imogen Astos understood that her husband intended to attend the coronation of the king without her. He did not say it cruelly. That was the worst part. He said it the way he said most things to her now, evenly, distantly, as though reading from a ledger of decisions already made and not open to revision. It would not be appropriate, Julian Astos, Duke of Cravenhurst, said, not looking up from the correspondence on his desk. Westminster Abbey will be filled with every family of consequence in England. The eyes of the entire kingdom will be on that room. I cannot have, he stopped himself, but the sentence finished itself in the silence that followed. You cannot have me there, Imogen said quietly. It was not a question. I did not say that. You did not need to. He set down his pen at last and looked at her, and for a moment she saw something flicker behind his grey eyes, something that might have been shame, or might have been simply the particular discomfort of a man caught in the act of being exactly as cold as everyone already believed him to be. Then it was gone, smoothed over by the same composure that had governed his face for the 3 years of their marriage. The arrangements are already made, he said. I will attend with my sister. You will remain at Cravenhurst. It is a single day, Imogen. I see no reason to make it into something larger than it is. But it was already larger than that. It had been larger than that since the morning, 3 years ago, when he had married her in a small chapel with no flowers and no guests, in exchange for the £40,000 that had kept his father's debts from swallowing the last of the family's land. She had known, going in, that it was a transaction. She had not expected, 3 years later, to still be waiting for it to become something else. She did not argue with him. She had learned, in 3 years, that arguing with Julian Astos was like arguing with a closed door. The door did not open because you raised your voice at it, and you only tired yourself in the trying. So she said only, "As you wish, your grace," and left his study with her spine straight and her hand steady, and she did not allow herself to weep until she had reached the long gallery, where the portraits of dead duchesses watched her pass with their painted, indifferent eyes. She had grown up the daughter of a country solicitor in a market town called Aldermere, in a house with too many books and never quite enough coal, the second of 3 sisters in a family that had genteel manners and very little money. Her father had been a kind man with a weakness for lending sums he could not afford to lend, and when he died, the debts he left behind had very nearly taken the roof from over his daughters' heads. It was her uncle, a man of business with connections among the lesser nobility, who had first mentioned the Duke of Cravenhurst's predicament to her mother, a young duke with an old title and an empty treasury, in need of a fortune more than he was in need of a bride with the right surname. Imogen had not been the family's first choice to offer him. Her elder sister, Beatrice, was the beauty, golden-haired, easy in company, the kind of woman who filled a room without trying. But Beatrice was already secretly attached to a young curate with no prospects, and rather than break her sister's heart for the sake of a title neither of them wanted, Imogen had quietly volunteered herself instead. She had told herself, at the time, that it did not matter. She had no particular hopes of love. She had only hoped, perhaps, for kindness, and for a life that did not require her to watch her mother count coal by the scuttle each winter. She had gotten the second. She was still waiting for the first. Cravenhurst Hall was beautiful in the way that old, exhausted things are sometimes beautiful, all grey stone and ivy and long windows that let in too much weather and not quite enough light. When she had first arrived as a bride of 19, the house had been cold in every sense the word allowed. The roof leaked over the east gallery. Half the tenant farms had not seen a repair in a decade. The household accounts, when she finally persuaded the steward to show them to her, read like a slow and dignified description of a family bleeding to death. Julian had not asked for her help with any of it. He had assumed, she came to understand, that she would do what most duchesses of convenience did, wear the jewels, host the dinners, produce an heir if possible, and otherwise stay out of the business of the estate, which he considered his alone to salvage or to lose. He had not expected a wife who read account books for pleasure, who had grown up watching her father's modest practice nearly collapse and had learned, in the watching, exactly which mistakes ruined a household and exactly which small corrections saved one. She had started small. A suggestion here passed through the steward rather than directly to her husband, because she had learned quickly that Julian received advice from his wife the way other men received insults. A reallocation of the wool contracts that added £400 a year to the estate's income without costing the tenants a shilling. A new system for the home farms accounts that caught a clerk's quiet embezzlement before it had bled the estate of more than £40. None of it announced. All of it filtered upward through Mr. Pell, the steward, who had been managing Cravenhurst's affairs since before Julian was born and who had recognized, within a season, that the new Duchess possessed precisely the kind of mind the estate had been missing for 2 generations. "You did this," Julian had said to her once, early in their marriage, holding a quarterly report that showed the home farm's yield improved by nearly a fifth. He had not meant it as a compliment. He had meant it as an accusation, as though she had reached into his affairs without his leave and rearranged them to suit herself. "Mr. Pell did it," she had said. "I only suggested where the seed money might be better spent. You suggested it to my steward rather than to me. You did not wish to hear suggestions from me, Your Grace. You made that very clear in the first month of our marriage." He had not answered that, because there had been no answer that would not have required him to admit she was right, and admitting she was right was a thing Julian Astor's did with the same reluctance other men reserved for admitting cowardice. It was not that he disliked her. She understood that much, even in her worst hours of loneliness. He was simply a man who had built his entire adult life around a single principle, that the Cravenhurst name must never again be the subject of pity or scandal, and he had built that principle on the foundation of his father's ruin and his mother's disgrace, neither of which he had ever fully explained to her, though the servants whispered enough that she had pieced together the shape of it. A scandal involving his mother and a French count, some 30 years past. A duel that had nearly cost his father his life and certainly cost him his reputation. A childhood spent watching his family's name spoken in low, amused voices behind gloved hands at every ball his parents were too proud to stop attending. Julian Astor's had decided, somewhere in that childhood, that he would never again allow his family to be a subject of London's amusement. He had built walls instead of bridges, distance instead of warmth, and a wife who came with a fortune but no name worth mentioning had fit very tidily into the architecture of a life designed never to be noticed, never to be discussed, never to be anything but correct. A coronation, by its nature, was the opposite of unnoticed. Westminster Abbey would be packed with every duke, marquis, and earl in the kingdom, every duchess and countess dressed in jewels their families had been saving for generations, every name that mattered written into the programme of precedence that would be read aloud as the great families processed to their seats. It was, Imogen understood without being told, exactly the kind of occasion at which Julian feared his marriage, plain, transactional, undeniably beneath the splendor of the room, might draw exactly the kind of attention he had spent his whole life avoiding. Better, in his calculation, to attend alone with his sister, present the unimpeachable face of the Cravenhurst name, and leave his wife quietly at home, where she could not embarrass him by simply existing in a room full of people who knew precisely what her dowry had been and precisely why he had married her. She understood it. Understanding it did not make it hurt less. That evening, she did not go down to dinner. She told the maid she had a headache, which was not entirely a lie, and she sat instead in the small sitting room that had become hers over 3 years of careful, quiet claiming, a room with good light and a writing desk and a single overstuffed chair by the fire that nobody else in the house wanted, and which had therefore become, by simple attrition, the one space in Cravenhurst Hall that belonged entirely to her. It was there that her sister-in-law found her an hour later. Lady Cecilia Astos was 22, sharp-tongued, and possessed of the particular fondness for plain speaking that only the unmarried daughters of great houses seem permitted to indulge. She had been kind to Imogen from the first, not warm, precisely, but honest, which in that house had come to feel like the same thing. "He told me what he said to you," Cecilia announced, settling into the chair across from the fire without waiting to be invited. "About the coronation." "Did he?" "He did not look proud of himself while he said it, if that comforts you at all." "It does not, particularly." Cecilia studied her for a long moment, the firelight moving across her face. "You could fight him on it." "Other women would." Lady Hartington made her husband's life a misery for a fortnight when he tried to leave her behind for the King's birthday review, and she got her way in the end. "I am not other women," Imogen said. "And your brother does not yield to misery. He simply waits it out, the way stone waits out weather." "That is uncomfortably accurate." Cecilia was quiet for a moment. "May I tell you something? And you must not repeat it to him, because he would be unbearable about it." "You may." "He watches you," Cecilia said. "When you do not know he is watching. At dinner, when you are explaining something to Mr. Pell about the tenancies, or when you are reading in this very chair with your feet tucked up under you in a manner no duchess in the history of England has ever Saturday. He watches you the way a man watches a fire he is not permitted to stand close to. I do not think he knows I have seen it. I do not think he entirely knows he does it himself." Imogen felt something tighten in her chest, not hope, exactly, because hope had become a dangerous thing to feel in that house, but something adjacent to it, something that ached in the same place hope would have ached. "If that is true," she said carefully, "it has not yet occurred to him to act upon it." "My brother," Cecilia said, with the particular weariness of a sister who has loved a brother for 22 years and found him both admirable and exhausting in roughly equal measure, does not act upon anything until the alternative becomes unbearable. He did not repair the east wing roof until it was raining into the gallery. He did not marry until the bank was a fortnight from foreclosure. I suspect he will not love his own wife until the alternative, losing her, becomes equally unbearable to him. I am sorry to say it so plainly, but I think you would rather know it than not." "I would," Imogen said. "Thank you." After Cecilia left, Imogen sat a long while looking into the fire, and she thought, not for the first time, that there were 2 ways a woman in her position could spend the remainder of her life. She could spend it waiting, quietly, patiently, hoping that some unbearable alternative would eventually present itself to her husband and shake him loose from his walls. Or she could spend it doing the only thing she had ever truly known how to do, which was work, and let whatever recognition came to her come from somewhere other than the man who had married her for her dowry and forgotten, somewhere in the transaction, to also marry her for herself. She chose the second. She had, in fact, already been choosing it for 3 years. In small ways the household had absorbed so thoroughly that nobody remarked upon them any more. It was simply that, on the night her husband told her she was not fit to be seen beside him at the coronation of the king, she chose it a little more deliberately, and a little more widely, than she had before. The opportunity, when it came from an unexpected direction, as opportunities so often do. Cravenhurst sat on the edge of a county that had, that winter, suffered one of the worst outbreaks of typhus fever in memory, sweeping through the laborious cottages along the river with a speed that outpaced the parish's modest charitable resources within a fortnight. Imogen had gone, at first, simply to bring baskets, bread, broth, the small comforts that cost little and meant a great deal to families too poor to afford a physician. But within a week she had seen enough of the sickness's pattern to recognize that bread and broth would not be sufficient, and she had done what she had always done when faced with a problem too large for sentiment alone. She had organized. She wrote to the county's physicians, offering Cravenhurst stables as a place to house horses for those willing to ride the sick rounds without charge, in exchange for the estate covering their costs quietly through Mr. Pell's accounts, attributed to nothing more remarkable than estate charitable disbursement. She converted the old dower house, long empty and slowly rotting at the edge of the park, into a fever house where the worst cases could be nursed away from their own crowded cottages, with proper ventilation and clean water, and women paid a fair wage to tend them, rather than left to the inadequate mercies of overwhelmed families. She sent to London for quinine bark at her own expense, using the small personal allowance her husband had settled on her at marriage and never since inquired after, and she did not tell Julian any of it, partly because she suspected he would object to the dower house being used for fever cases so near the main hall, and partly, if she was honest with herself, which she tried always to be, even when it cost her something, because she had grown weary of bringing him good works only to watch him receive them as though they were minor inconveniences he must now find some way to politely tolerate. The fever passed, eventually, as fevers do. 41 people in the parish had died of it before the worst was over, a terrible number, but a number that the parish's own rector later told her, with tears standing frankly in his eyes, would have been double or triple that without the dower house and the quinine and the horses in Cravenhurst stables. He had written of it, that rector, to the bishop, as was proper, and then, because the bishop's secretary happened to be a man with connections at court, the letter had travelled further than any of them intended, until it landed, in the way such things sometimes do, on a desk belonging to a lady-in-waiting to the new queen, who collected such stories the way some collect rare flowers, for the particular pleasure of bringing them to royal attention. Imogen knew none of this. She had returned, by the time the fever broke, to the ordinary business of being the Duchess of Cravenhurst, overseeing accounts, managing the household, being quietly present at her husband's side at the dinners and assemblies where his position required a wife to be displayed, however briefly, however coldly. She did not think of the dower house again except to note, with a private satisfaction she shared with no one, that it had been useful at last, after years of standing empty and unloved. The summons to court, when it arrived 3 months later, arrived not for Julian but for her, a small, plain note delivered by a royal messenger, requesting that the Duchess of Cravenhurst present herself for a private audience with one of the Queen's ladies regarding a matter of charitable interest. Julian read the note over her shoulder with an expression she could not entirely parse, surprise, certainly, and something underneath the surprise that looked almost like the beginning of alarm. "What have you done?" he asked, and there was an edge to it that she recognized at once, the old fear surfacing without his permission, the fear that something had drawn attention, and attention, in his experience, was never anything but danger. "I have not the faintest idea," she said, which was entirely true. "I imagine I am about to find out." He did not offer to accompany her. She did not ask him to. The audience, when it came, was brief and disorienting in the particular way that brushes with greatness so often are. Lady Ashworth Pell, no relation to her own Mr. Pell, though the coincidence amused her privately, was a woman of perhaps 50 with sharp, kind eyes and the unhurried manner of someone entirely secure in her own importance, and she had asked Imogen a series of careful questions about the fever house, the quinine, the wages paid to the nurses, the system by which the sick had been sorted and housed and treated, And Imogen had answered them honestly and without embellishment, because embellishment had never come naturally to her, and she saw no reason to begin practicing it now. "You did all this," Lady Ashworth-Pell said at the end, "without your husband's knowledge, and at your own personal expense." "I did it because it needed doing," Imogen said. Whether anyone knew of it seemed a separate question. Lady Ashworth-Pell had smiled then, a small private smile that Imogen did not fully understand until much later. "Her Majesty," she said, "has asked me to find, among the great houses of England, instances of genuine and unrewarded charity to be recognized at the coronation, not the performances that great families stage for applause, Your Grace, but the quiet work that gets done because someone with the means to look away chose instead to look closer. I believe I have found one." "Recognized," Imogen repeated, with the particular blankness of a woman who has not understood she is being offered something significant until it is already nearly past her. "Recognized how?" "That," said Lady Ashworth-Pell, rising to indicate the audience was at its end, "is a thing I am not yet at liberty to say. But I would advise the Duchess of Cravenhurst to be present at the Abbey on Coronation Day, regardless of whatever her husband may have already arranged. I would advise it very strongly indeed." Imogen returned to Cravenhurst that evening with her mind turning over the conversation from every angle and arriving, each time, at the same place. She did not know what was coming, only that something was, and that it would not wait politely upon her husband's permission. She told no one but Cecilia, who received the news with the particular gleeful satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting 3 years for her brother to be confronted with consequences he had not foreseen and could not control. "You must go," Cecilia said. "Whatever it is. You must be in that abbey." "He has already said I am not to attend." "He said you would not attend with him," Cecilia corrected. "He did not forbid you the kingdom. There is, I am reliably informed, an entire gallery of seating reserved for ladies of rank attending independently of their husbands' parties, for precisely the kind of circumstance in which a woman might have her own business at court that does not require her husband's escort. I shall write to Lady Pemberton this very evening. She owes me a favour from my disastrous debut season, and she sits on the committee that allocates exactly such seats." "Cecilia!" "Imogen!" Cecilia took her hands, and her voice, usually so quick and sharp, gentled into something almost grave. "You have spent 3 years making this family solvent and this estate sound and these tenants alive who would otherwise be dead, and you have done all of it while my brother decided you were a problem to be managed rather than a woman to be loved. I do not know what the Queen's lady-in-waiting intends. But I know that whatever it is, you have earned the right to be in that room when it happens, with or without his blessing. Let him learn, for once in his life, that the world does not wait for his permission to recognize what is plainly in front of it." Imogen wept then, finally, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not from sorrow, precisely, though there was sorrow folded into it, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being told, by someone who knew her well, that she had been right to keep working quietly in the dark all this time, that the work had not been wasted, that someone besides herself had finally noticed. And while Imogen finally receives the validation she has waited years to hear, I'd love to hear from you as well. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me bring you more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? I'd genuinely love to know where in the world you're joining us from. Now, let's see what happened when Coronation Day finally arrived. The morning of the coronation arrived grey and cold over London, the kind of low English sky that seemed determined to deny the occasion any pageantry of weather, though it could not deny the pageantry of everything else. The city had been transformed in the preceding fortnight, banners along every major thoroughfare, soldiers in dress uniform stationed at every corner, the great bell of the abbey already beginning its slow, ceremonial tolling by the time Imogen's hired carriage reached the edge of the crowds gathered along the procession route, too thick now for any vehicle to pass through without an escort she did not have and had not thought to arrange. She had told no one at Cravenhurst House in town where she was going. She had simply risen before dawn, dressed in the one truly fine gown she owned, a deep wine-coloured silk that had been her mother's, recut and remade by a sempstress in Aldermere 2 summers past for an occasion that had never come, until now, and she had walked, in the final stretch, the last half-mile to the Abbey on foot, her skirts gathered in one hand and Cecilia's borrowed seating voucher clutched in the other, because Cecilia, true to her word, had secured it within 2 days of asking. With a triumphant note attached that read only, "I told you so," will not begin to cover my satisfaction when this is over. The gallery for ladies of independent rank was a narrow space high along the north transept, crowded with women in jewels and feathers who looked at Imogen's plain wine-coloured silk with the brief, assessing glances society women reserve for anyone whose name they do not immediately recognize. She did not mind it. She had grown used to being looked at and found wanting by people who did not know what they were looking at. She found her seat, settled her hands in her lap, and watched the great procession begin to assemble below, the peers in their crimson and ermine, the bishops in their vestments, the long slow river of England's nobility moving toward their appointed places beneath the soaring stone. She saw Julian before he saw her. He stood near the front of the procession, in the place his rank demanded, Cecilia at his side in pale blue silk, and even from that distance, even in a crowd of several thousand, Imogen recognized the particular tightness in his shoulders that meant he was uncomfortable, that he was enduring rather than experiencing the occasion, that some part of him was already calculating how soon he might decently leave. She did not call out to him. There would have been no point. The noise of the Abbey, filling now with the low roar of thousands of voices and the distant brass of the royal procession's approach, would have swallowed her voice entirely. She simply watched him, and felt, watching him, the strange ache of loving a man who did not yet know he had not lost the capacity to be loved. The ceremony itself unfolded with the slow, grinding magnificence such occasions are designed to possess, the anointing, the investiture, the great crown lowered onto the king's head to a fanfare that seemed to shake the very stones of the abbey, the assembled peerage rising as one in a wave of crimson and gold to render their homage. Imogen watched it with the part of her mind that could still be moved by spectacle, and watched her husband with the part of her mind that never stopped watching him, no matter how cruel he had sometimes been in failing to notice. It was after the crowning, in the long ceremonial pause before the procession began its slow reformation for the return to the palace, that the herald stepped forward with a scroll bearing the seal of the Queen's own household, and the Abbey, by long custom, fell silent for the reading of those names Her Majesty had chosen, of her own personal prerogative, to honour before the assembled peerage of the realm, a tradition. The herald announced in a voice trained to carry to every corner of that vast stone room, newly revived by Her Majesty's own wish, that the coronation of a new reign might also mark the recognition of those whose service to the kingdom went too often unseen. There were perhaps a dozen names on the list. Imogen understood later: soldiers, a physician who had worked through 3 separate fever outbreaks without pay, a schoolmistress who had taught the children of a mining village to read at her own expense for 30 years. But it was not the soldiers' names, nor the physicians', nor the schoolmistresses', that the herald read first. Her Majesty the Queen, the herald announced, his voice ringing up into the vaulted stone, wishes it known to this assembly that the first name upon this roll of honour belongs to a lady whose charity, undertaken in complete privacy and at considerable personal cost, preserved the lives of a parish struck by fever this past winter past, asking no recognition and seeking none, until the truth of her work came to Her Majesty's own attention by chance. Her Majesty wishes that lady to know that true nobility is measured not by the name a woman is given at birth, nor even by the title she carries in marriage, but by the use she makes of the power placed in her hands. Her Majesty calls, before all others, the name of Imogen, Duchess of Cravenhurst. The silence that followed was the particular silence of several thousand people simultaneously failing to understand what they have just heard. Imogen sat frozen in her seat in the north gallery, her hands gone entirely numb in her lap, her heart performing some complicated maneuver in her chest that felt nothing at all like joy and nothing at all like fear and yet contained elements of both. Below, on the Abbey floor, she saw Julian turn, saw him search the crowd with an expression of pure, naked confusion, as though the words had reached him in a foreign language he was only now beginning to translate, and then she saw him find her, high in the gallery in her plain wine-colored silk, and she watched, from that distance, the precise moment his confusion gave way to something else entirely. The herald was still speaking, calling her forward by the Queen's own request, to receive Her Majesty's personal thanks before the full assembly, and Imogen rose because there was nothing else to do but rise, her legs unsteady beneath her, and made her way down through the gallery and out into the great open transept where every eye in that vast room turned to watch her cross the stone floor toward the dais where the new Queen sat, attended by Lady Ashworth-Pell, who caught Imogen's eye for the briefest moment and offered the smallest, most satisfied of smiles. The Queen herself was younger than Imogen had expected, with a direct, unflinching gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying easily in the hush that had fallen over the Abbey, "I am told you built a fever house from an abandoned dower house in a single fortnight, found physicians willing to ride free rounds through your own persuasion alone, and paid for the bark that broke 40 fevers out of your own personal allowance, all without ever telling a soul beyond your own steward what you had done. Is this true?" "It is true, Your Majesty," Imogen said, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, "though I confess I did none of it imagining it would ever be spoken of in a room such as this." "That," said the Queen, "is precisely why I wished it spoken of in a room such as this. England has no shortage of women who will perform charity loudly, for the credit of it. It has a great shortage of women who will perform it quietly, for the good of it. I should like the peerage of this kingdom to understand the difference, on this day above all others." She rose, and the entire Abbey rose with her, a great rustling wave of silk and crimson, and she took from a cushion held by a page a small enamelled medal on a ribbon of deep blue, the Queen's own personal Order of Merit, newly instituted, the herald explained afterward to a crowd of breathless onlookers, specifically for this occasion and this purpose, and she placed it with her own hands around Imogen's neck, and said, for the whole of the Abbey to hear, "Let it be known that the Crown recognizes true service before it recognizes ancient names. Duchess of Cravenhurst, you have my gratitude, and the gratitude of every soul in that parish who is alive this morning because of you." Imogen did not remember, afterward, exactly what she said in reply, something about duty, something about the rector and the physicians and Mr. Pell, the names of everyone who had helped her, because she could not bear to stand in that vast silence and receive the credit alone for work that had been, in truth, the work of an entire frightened, grieving community pulling together. But she remembered, with absolute clarity, turning back toward the body of the Abbey afterward, the blue ribbon cool and strange against her collarbone, and finding her husband's face among the thousands turned toward her. He was not composed. For the first time in the whole of their marriage, in the most public room in England, Julian Astor's, Duke of Cravenhurst, stood with his careful, distant mask entirely undone, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears and might have been simple shock, his hand pressed flat against his chest as though he were holding something inside it by force. She did not go to him immediately. There was a procession still to be managed, courtesies still to be paid, and she moved through the remainder of the ceremony in a kind of golden haze, aware of every eye upon her, aware that the woman who had walked into that abbey in a recut silk gown that nobody recognized would not be the same woman who walked out of it. It was only afterward, in the crush of the crowd spilling out into the grey daylight of the abbey yard, that Julian finally reached her, pushing through a knot of curious onlookers with an urgency she had never once seen him display in 3 years of marriage. "You did all of that," he said, and his voice was not steady at all, "and you told me nothing." "You did not ask," she said. It came out sharper than she intended, 3 years of small accumulated silences finally finding their way into her voice. "You have never once asked, Julian, what I do with my days, or my allowance, or my mind. You married me for £40,000 and you have spent 3 years treating the rest of me as an inconvenience attached to the sum. I did not tell you because I had stopped believing you wished to be told." He flinched, visibly, as though she had struck him, and perhaps, in a way, she had. "I was wrong," he said. "I have been wrong about a great many things, it appears, all at once, in the middle of Westminster Abbey, in front of the entire peerage of England." A short, disbelieving laugh escaped him, with no humour in it at all. "The Queen herself called your name before she called a single duke's. Before mine. Imogen, I forbade you from this room not a fortnight past, and the Crown itself has just told me, in front of every person whose opinion I have spent my whole life fearing, that I was a fool to do it." "You were," she agreed, because she had decided, somewhere in the past hour, that she was finished softening the truth for his comfort. "I am sorry." The word seemed to cost him something physical to say, as though he were lifting a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten it could be set down. "Not only for the coronation. For 3 years. I told myself I was protecting the name, protecting the family, when I think now that I was only protecting myself from being known, from being seen to need anything, from ever again being the subject of the kind of whispers that followed my parents through every room they ever entered. I built a wall to keep the world from laughing at me, and I did not understand, until this very hour, that I had built it directly through the middle of my own marriage, and that you were the one paying the cost of brick and mortar I laid for my own fear." Imogen studied him in the cold grey light of the Abbey yard, this man she had married for the sake of her family's survival and had come, against all her own careful expectations, to love anyway, slowly and without his ever once asking her to. "I did not do any of it to prove myself to you," she said. "I want you to understand that. The Fever House, the accounts, all of it, I did it because the work needed doing, and I am the sort of person who does the work in front of her rather than waits for permission to be useful. If the Queen had never heard of it, I would have done it all the same, and felt it worth doing all the same." "I know that," he said. "That is precisely why it matters so much that she did hear of it. You have spent 3 years being exactly who you are, quietly, faithfully, without once requiring my notice to justify it. I am the only person in this entire kingdom, it seems, who did not already understand what kind of woman I had married." He reached for her hand, there in the crowded yard, in front of footmen and strangers and at least 2 duchesses who were watching with undisguised curiosity, and he did not seem, for the first time she could remember, to care in the slightest who saw. "I cannot undo 3 years in a single afternoon. I know that. But I am asking you, Imogen, not as a duke to his duchess, not as a transaction concluded, but as a man who has just watched his wife receive from the Crown the recognition he was too blind and too frightened to give her himself, I am asking whether there is any part of you still willing to let me try. To actually know you. To actually be known by you, walls and fears and all of it, rather than hiding behind the cold correctness I mistook for safety." She looked at his face, not the Duke's face, composed and careful, but the real one underneath it, raw with something that had clearly been working its way to the surface for longer than this single morning, and she thought of 3 years of quiet work done in the dark, and of Cecilia's words by the fire. He does not act upon anything until the alternative becomes unbearable, and she understood, finally, that the unbearable alternative had arrived. In the middle of Westminster Abbey, in the form of a queen calling her name before his, and that he had met it not with retreat but with the truth. "I am willing," she said, "to let you try. But I will tell you now, so there is no mistaking it later, I will not go back to being quietly useful and quietly invisible, even for you. Whatever this marriage becomes from this day forward, it will include all of me, not only the parts convenient to the Cravenhurst name." "I would not want it any other way," he said, and for the first time in 3 years, when he looked at her, she did not feel like a ledger entry he was obliged to balance. She felt, simply and entirely, seen. They did not return to Cravenhurst Hall that week, nor the week after. London kept them, first with the obligatory rounds of congratulation that followed any royal recognition, every drawing-room in the capital suddenly eager to host the Duchess who had been singled out by the Queen herself, and Julian, to Imogen's quiet astonishment, attended every single one of them at her side, no longer positioning himself a careful half-step apart from her in the manner he had cultivated for 3 years, but standing close, his hand finding the small of her back in rooms full of precisely the kind of people whose whispers he had once feared above all things. "They are not laughing at you," she told him quietly, at the third such gathering, watching him survey a crowded ballroom with the old wary tension still visible in his shoulders, even now. "They have never once laughed at you, Julian. I do not think they ever truly laughed at your parents either, not the way you remember it. I think a frightened boy heard amusement in rooms that were mostly indifferent, and built a fortress against an enemy that was, for the most part, simply not paying attention. Perhaps," he admitted. "Or perhaps I built the fortress because admitting the rooms were indifferent felt worse than believing they were cruel. Cruelty, at least, can be fought. Indifference cannot." "Then fight it differently," she said. "Be interesting instead of unreachable. Be known instead of merely correct. I promise you, the alternative is lonelier than anything London ever whispered about your father." He had looked at her for a long moment, there in the noise and heat of that crowded room, and something in his face had eased, not all at once, not completely, because 3 decades of careful armor does not fall away in a single season, but enough that she saw, for the first time, the shape of the man he might become if he allowed himself the slow, deliberate work of becoming it. It was Cecilia who told her, weeks later, that Julian had gone alone to the rector of the parish where the fever house still stood, quietly converted now into a permanent infirmary at his own express order and his own express expense, and had spent an entire afternoon walking the wards, speaking with the women who still worked there as nurses, asking each of them, by name, what they needed that they did not yet have. He had not told Imogen he was going. She learned of it only when the rector wrote to thank her for the new wing he understood the Duke intended to fund, and she had sat with that letter in her lap for a long while, in the chair by the fire that had once been the only space in Cravenhurst Hall that belonged to her alone, and felt something in her chest a knot that she had not fully realized was still tied so tight. When he came to her that evening, she did not mention the letter. She only asked him, as he settled into the chair across from her own, a habit he had begun keeping in recent weeks, sitting with her in that small, quiet room in the evenings rather than retreating to his study, whether the infirmary had everything it required. "Nearly," he said. "I am told it wants a proper physician in permanent residence, rather than the rotating mercy of volunteers, which is a considerable expense, but one I find myself entirely willing to bear." He paused, studying the fire rather than her face, in the particular manner of a man working up to something he has not yet learned to say easily. I have been thinking that we might call it something other than simply the parish infirmary. I thought, perhaps, the Cravenhurst Infirmary, in your honour, though I understand if you would rather it carry no name at all, given how little you have ever sought credit for any of it. I would rather it carry your name beside mine, she said. Not because either of us requires the credit, but because I should like the record to show, for whoever reads it 100 years from now, that the Duke and Duchess of Cravenhurst built it together. He looked at her then, and the firelight caught something unguarded in his expression that she had only begun, in recent weeks, to learn to recognize, not the cold composure of the man she had married, nor even the raw shock of the man who had found her in the Abbey gallery, but something steadier than either, something that looked, she thought, very much like a man falling in love with his own wife for the very first time. 3 years and 1 coronation later than he ought to have managed it. Together, then, he said. I find I am rather fond of the word, where you are concerned. I spent 3 years believing that loving you openly would somehow diminish what little dignity I had left to my name. I understand now that I had the equation precisely backward. It is the withholding that diminishes a man. The loving, I think, only ever makes him larger. She crossed the small space between their 2 chairs and knelt before him, taking his hands in hers, and she said, with the same plain honesty she had given the Queen of England not 2 months past, "Then love me openly, Julian. I have been waiting 3 years for permission to stop being careful with you. I find I am rather tired of being careful." He drew her up and into his arms instead of answering, and when he kissed her, properly, finally, without the old distance he had kept folded between them like a second skin, she felt the last of the cold stone walls of Cravenhurst Hall recede into something that, for the first time since she had arrived there as a frightened bride of 19, felt entirely and unmistakably like a home. They did not have a grand second wedding, nor any public renewal of vows, though London society, forever hungry for a story it could retell at every dinner table for a season, would have eagerly attended one had they offered it. Instead, on a quiet morning the following spring, Julian rode out with her to the low stone wall that marked the boundary between the home farm and the river meadows, the same fields the fever had once swept through, now green and ordinary and entirely unremarkable, exactly as fields ought to be, and he told her there, with no audience but the cattle and the hedgerows, that he loved her, not as a duchess, not as the woman who had saved his accounts or his tenants or his name, but simply as Imogen, the daughter of a country solicitor who had once volunteered to marry a stranger so that her sister's heart might remain unbroken, and who had spent every year since proving, quietly and without once asking for recognition, exactly what kind of woman the world had nearly overlooked. "I love you," he said again, because he found, once he had finally learned to say it, that he did not wish to stop. "I should like to say it to you every day for the rest of our lives, until you are thoroughly tired of hearing it." "I do not believe I shall ever tire of it," Imogen said, laughing despite the tears standing in her eyes. "Though I shall hold you to the promise regardless, Your Grace, and you will find I am a far more exacting auditor of promises than I ever was of the household accounts." "I would expect nothing less," he said, "from the only duchess in England whose name was ever called before a duke's." And it was true, in the years that followed, that London never quite stopped telling the story of the coronation where the crown itself had reached past every ancient title in the realm to recognize a quiet, overlooked duchess for the work she had done in the dark, and of the cold duke who had tried to leave her behind and instead found, in the space of a single autumn morning, the wife he had never fully allowed himself to see. But Imogen, when she told the story herself, in later years, to her own daughters gathered by the fire in the same small sitting room that had once been her only refuge, always finished it the same way. "Your father did not love me because the Queen called my name first," she would say. He loved me because, once he finally looked, he found there was a whole woman standing in front of him who had been there the entire time, waiting, not for his permission, but simply for his attention. Remember that, when you are grown, and someone tells you that you must be loud to be valued, or beautiful to be seen, or born to the right name to matter. The quietest work, done faithfully and without an audience, is very often the work that changes the world. And if you are patient, and if you are fortunate, it is also, eventually, the work that someone worth loving finally learns to see. And Julian, listening from the doorway, as he so often did during these tellings, never once corrected a single word of it, because in all the years since that grey coronation morning, he had never found anything in his wife's account of their story that was not entirely, unflinchingly true.